Thanks, Anthony, for the introduction. Welcome, Josh, to what I hope will be a very interesting discussion. Thanks to everyone for coming from all over the world. Josh, your book's fascinating. How to Live, What to Do. That's the title. The title, What to Live, How to Do, sounds incredibly prescriptive. But this I don't think is anything like a typical self-help novel. A typical self-help book. Why not?
Why not? Well, first of all, just to say, it's lovely to be talking to you, Lars. I fully endorse everything that has been said about the Spurious trilogy and Nietzsche and the Burbs, and would encourage everybody to read those actually rather different sets of reflections and explorations on how to live and what to do. But the title is in fact filched from the title of a poem by Wallace Stevens. And I wouldn't say that the book's relationship to those two phrases is quite as oblique as Stevens' poems, but it is an oblique one. It is not, it is invoking. I mean, Stevens' poem invokes a kind of prescriptive agenda in order to undermine it. It's a poem in which a man, or rather a speaker, we don't even know if the speaker's a man, the speaker and his companion are walking in a kind of nameless landscape, searching for what the speaker calls a son of fuller fire. That is, some spectacle in nature that will be a kind of consummation of all the longings and excitements of the poet's imagination. And instead what they land in front of is a rather unprepossessing tuft of rock. And this rock is suddenly possessed with a different kind of magic. The magic of what Stevens calls in another poem, the plain sense of things. The idea that there is a kind of enchantment in disenchantment, in the bareness of the sound of the wind. And that's what this pair end up listening to. So it's a kind of atheistic, sort of unmagical world that acquires its magic from its plainness, from its ordinariness. And that's one of the ways, I suppose, into this book, because it's in a way an attempt to extract strangeness from the ordinary scenarios of life.
Thank you. That's a very interesting answer. So, How to Live, What to Do is the name of this poem by Wallace Stevens. And what confounds us with that poem is that the title is so prescriptive, and yet what we get in the poem is so unexpectedly oblique. And I think it's similar in your work. This is the fourth book I think you've written now on psychoanalysis. I have a couple of the others right here, and these are all really very fine books. Not Working, The Private Life, Why Remain in the Dark. And what you're articulating here is a version of psychoanalysis in which, as I understand it, what the therapist tries to do is to orientate the person, unlike the analysand, to orientate the patient to life. It's an orientation to living that you're trying to achieve in these sessions in your consulting room. How do you understand the orientation to life?
I think that these days, people often come to psychoanalysis as a last resort. They feel that something is blocked or broken, in any case, that life isn't really living for them. And they will often speak of sort of feeling at a remove from themselves, unable to find whatever it is that makes their life interesting and that makes themselves, their own selfhood, interesting to them, that opens up their curiosity. And often by the time people come to me, they've tried a number of other fixes. They've tried behavioral therapies, perhaps, or they've tried mindfulness meditation. They've tried a sort of time-limited formula that has been offered to them by, our public health service, and which has been itself sort of bearing the weight of austerity. 4 or 6 sessions, and a sense that the turnover has to be quick, that we don't want necessarily to be too interested in the liveliness of your life, that the purpose is to restore a kind of functionality to your life. Now, the problem is that functionality may well have been the malaise. The sense not that, you'd broken down and you weren't compliant anymore, that you weren't able to live in the world on its terms, but on the contrary, that you were living in the world too much on its terms, in too compliant and unquestioning a way. And so I think what puts people off about psychoanalysis in the first instance, which is that it's open-ended, that it's long-term, that there are no guarantees attached to it in terms of finding fulfillment, happiness, and success. Everything about that suddenly becomes, if not attractive, at least interesting, at least worth a try, because what it then is inviting anyone to do is to just be curious about themselves at their own pace and in their own time. And something about that feels liberating and subversive.
One of the things I was very interested in your programmatic claims you make about psychoanalysis in your work. I always underline them, these passages, and think about them. And just to echo what you've just been saying, you say, this is to quote from the book: "When psychotherapy is successful, it works in much the way that great fiction works. That is, it induces the near miraculous sensation of the very core of ourselves being seen." That's a wonderful way of putting it. It sets a mirror before us in which we see not only the self we know, but the self we don't. And just following these passages from the opening of How to Live and What to Do, you mention an author who you mentioned in your other work as well, who I also regard extremely highly, and that is Charles M. Schulz, who wrote Peanuts,
Yes,
Snoopy, Charlie Brown and the Gang. And he runs through your other books as well. So this is something you talk about as being a particularly important author to you when you were very young.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you mentioned him, because I have a sort of secret. My regard for my interlocutor immediately sort of ratchets up about 10 notches as soon as they mention Schultz and Peanuts. So yes, I actually sort of go a little bit further with my allusion this time, in the sense that I sort of suggest almost in passing that Peanuts was my first psychoanalyst. But one of the things that, what I think I mean by that is that one of the things that we look for without knowing that we're looking for it when we start to read is to recognize ourselves. Now, by recognition, I don't mean what is often referred to in cultural criticism, sort of pop cultural criticism today, as relatability. Because relatability is about finding in a character or a situation what we already know about ourselves. And I'm not sure why one would necessarily go to a book to find out what we already know. what I'm talking about is the startling moment where you recognize what you didn't yet know, where you discover yourself, and become strange to yourself, but strangely familiar. So it is both at once paradoxically alienating because you didn't know this about yourself, but also deeply sharpening. And that's really what Schultz gave me as a first reading experience, much more than any of my other early reading experiences, which I appreciated simply for, describing the contours of the world to me in ways that felt familiar. Schultz gave me back, these characters gave me my insecurity, my envy, my anxiety, my sort of the difficult relationship between the self that I wanted to show the world and the self that I hide behind my outward persona. And all of those, I think, come to us in these sort of strangely rudimentary doodles and marks and scratches, these tiny but decisive adjustments in the positioning of a mouth or an eyebrow, which turn joy into the sort of the profoundest pain. So yes, I mean, he's an author I go back to and pick off the shelf as much as I do Lawrence or Wallace Stevens.
Yes, indeed, I sense that. And to read from your book, you say reading it through the course of my childhood. You talk about Peanuts in general. Charles M. Schultz's great work gave shape to my inadequacy, insecurity, rage, cruelty, envy, self-regard, and desperation, as well as to my occasional joy and hilarity. In short, to the whole landscape of my inner life. It's when it unsettles rather than confirms our pictures of the world and of ourselves that a book is the most thrilling and most transformative. And this links up to something you talk about throughout the book, the idea that psychoanalysis is something which helps us become what we are or who we are. But the point you're making is psychoanalysis is about becoming something that we don't want to recognize, we don't want to confront. There's something very difficult and confusing about this process. Now, you as a psychoanalyst are helping your patients work their way through to come to some kind of adjustment to the situation. But what you're doing is not giving them, as you said earlier, a simple functionality that they can just go out into the world and do what everyone else does. You're helping them confront confusion and pain, not necessarily to overcome and leave it behind once and for all, but you're just trying to help them feel alive in life, insofar as feeling alive is about confronting confusion and pain.
Yeah, that's right. I was going to say that's one of the reasons I find a lot of affinity reading your novels, Lars, particularly the most recent one, actually, which seems to me to be very much about that. So yes, feeling more alive in life. One of the things that interests me more and more about what the work can do is that it can seem like quite a hermetic and individually sealed off affair, this interest in enlivening life. And yet it crosses, I think, with a project which has much kind of broader social and political cogency and relevance, in the sense that it's very difficult now to talk about a life that doesn't feel livable without thinking about the ways that our inner lives are inflected by the world outside, by all the things that our culture does to compromise our sense of aliveness, to cut ourselves off from it. And so, you know, and I suppose, you know, the previous two books about work and about privacy are very much about the ways that the outside world can often come in and compromise a rich living relationship to our psychic lives.
To reawaken that relationship to our psychic lives involves what you call in the book an orientation to living that's actually hard to achieve for a lot of people. And one of the things your books does, and in fact all your recent books have done this, is to take us through case histories and to take us through accounts of people or composites of people you've met in your consulting room. And you show us how over a long period, and it can take years and years and years, but how over this long period, you allow people to find, well, what can we call it? A sense of their own destiny. And here I'm drawing on a psychoanalyst who I think is important to you, Christopher Bollas. And he tells us that psychoanalysis is about moving the patient from a sense of fatalism, from a sense that nothing could be otherwise, from a sense that the dice are already rolled and you're in the only world you can possibly be in. And what you want to do, like Bollas, is to move from this fatalism to an experience of one's own destiny, to an unconscious sense of direction that will tell us who we are and what we want. So you're very interesting on this. When you talk about the people who come to see you, they often come to see you and they say to you, I can't change. There's no way I can change. There's nothing I can do. I'm stuck. So how do you help people become unstuck?
Well, one of the most important prefaces to an answer would have to be that there isn't a guarantee, that I don't have a manualizable agenda that I can sort of offer as a prospectus to people coming in to say, this is what we're going to do to get you unstuck. In a way, the preliminaries to a piece of psychoanalytic work are the only thing about it that are short, because all you have to do really is say, we're going to start a process. I don't know how long it's going to last. Sit down or lie down, whichever you prefer. Tell me whatever comes to mind. Keep going. And, at some point we might fall into silence, and at some point I might say something. That's really about all anybody needs to know in order to embark on a psychoanalysis. In the course of that process, there is a kind of passage through a known self. People will start to talk initially about their childhoods, about their present day circumstances, and particularly about their sense of malaise in a way that is profoundly wearisome to them. They're telling the story that they already know about themselves. What you hope for in the course of that very tired, repetitious story is some point of entry where you say, but hang on. You find a chink of paradox, of contradiction, just something that seems curious, that seems not to quite fit. That might be something that it doesn't have to be me that notices this sort of sudden kink in the story. It might be them. But that is the moment at which the fatalistic version of their life that you're talking about suddenly can be brought into question. And they can see themselves from another angle. And the reason why sometimes opening sessions in psychoanalysis can be almost exaggeratedly hopeful and startling is because not always, but sometimes there is something quite liberating, a sort of rush of intense relief about having broken open the story that you know too well about yourself, about finding, I mean, almost another camera angle on your life, as though the camera has been trained on the world in such a way that there's just no new vista. Suddenly something else opens up, and it might just be a different corner of the sky. It might just be a different angle on your skirting boards, but it allows your version of yourself to spark in a way that it hasn't previously. It allows you to start telling your own story a bit differently.
There's a moment in How to Live, What to Do, where a very famous quotation comes up from the great writer Franz Kafka. And Kafka, you quote him saying this: we need books that affect us like a disaster, that grieve us deeply, like a suicide. A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's the quotation from Kafka that you wrote as a young man in a letter.
Yeah.
And what you say here, and this is your comment on this quotation, Kafka's metaphor connotes both violence and liberation. Caught up in the routines and habits of daily living, it is easier and safer to exist at the surface, to cut off from the pain and grief, as well as the joy and excitement that come with having an inner life. And that's the idea, I think, you're putting forward, this idea of living life, of orientating oneself towards life. There's going to be pain and grief, but that pain and grief is linked to joy and excitement. They come together. There's one account you give of someone you call Graham, who's a very educated man in his early 50s, and you discuss with him his misadventures in love when he was a young man, he was an adolescent. And you know, in your account, you say he always chuckles his way through these accounts he gives of his misadventures in love. And eventually, you say, you as his analyst, you wonder aloud why he seems to find these distressing experiences of his so funny. Well, he says, with the breezy worldliness of someone who's seen everything, it's all just adolescent histrionics, isn't it? I love this moment here in the book. It's wonderful. He's trapped in a dull administrative job. He feels stuck. He feels his life is tedious. Yet at the same time, he doesn't want to open himself to pain. He doesn't want to be vulnerable. He doesn't want, as part of that, to open himself to the possibility of joy as well. He hasn't escaped his stuckness. What happened in the course of that analysis?
Of course, you know, I need to preface by saying that all the analyses are composite cases, and that I'm bringing together elements of different experiences. But there is something about the story of that case that I can say is very real, which is this disdain for the adolescent self, that at somewhere along the line, this person imagined that adulthood could only be assumed by a kind of brutal severance from his adolescent self, from what he calls the histrionics, the passion, the pain, the joy that had been so alive for him in these first experiences of love, but that I think he came to find sort of unmanageable, that they were felt in him as a kind of a too muchness, a rush of emotional and erotic stimulus that was better managed by really being extruded. You know, he felt that what it meant to be an adult was to cut off from the passions of life and love. And so I simply started to ask him why he felt that was the case. And it's not a case that I could say, you know, it's one of these cases that doesn't end in a kind of rounded narrative fulfillment where he sort of rides off into the sunset, reconnected with his passions and ready for ultimate fulfillment. But I think it was a good and interesting piece of work in the sense that actually, I mean, what the person that I'm thinking of, who is at something of an oblique angle to the Graham of the book, but the person that I'm thinking of, who was so cut off, started to read a lot more and to bring a kind of intense curiosity and a sort of a feeling for the ordinary things of life that he'd dismissed. And I think he started to become more interested in people, in friendships. And so I'm being a little bit sort of perhaps my cautiousness and my hesitation here is that I'm always kind of a bit worried about confidentiality. But this is a case in a way which ends with a beginning. In other words, this is somebody who I felt finished at the point that he felt ready to go on and begin a life of his own, that he would find a bit more than bearable, a bit more than something he was simply sort of walking through unconsciously, zombie-like. Somebody, he became somebody who was, he didn't sort of start a loving relationship or a glittering new career. And in some ways, the work involved him coming to terms with the feeling that it was too late to completely reinvent himself or start from scratch, but that he could be interested in the life that he already had, that there was so much around him that to be curious about and to embrace. And that started with sort of, you know, that Stevens gesture of sort of just opening the curtain and looking at the sky.
It brings us back to the poem, the Stevens poem, and the idea that the narrator of the poem, the main character of the poem, and the companion have gone off to find this sun full of fire, this ultimate object of worship. They're looking for something, but instead of searching vainly for this elusive thing, they stop at something right in front of them, right there, and they listen to it. This idea of listening is important throughout this, throughout your book. They're there, they're attending to something quite ordinary. So on this epic spiritual mission to find more, as you write, the man and his companion have stumbled across the truth and beauty of less. And in this case study, Graham's, what happened to Graham was he was able not to completely change his life. He's a middle-aged man, but to accept that life as it is and to find interesting things in that life, things which he was able to live more fully than previously. Now, your book is structured very interestingly. You explore how the orientation of living can be facilitated, frustrated in 8 stages of life, from childhood to old age. And you take us through childhood, through adolescence, through middle age to old age. And as you do so, you also introduce in each chapter characters from a couple of centuries of fiction. And you argue that one of the things that we find in fiction is a way of attending to the singularity of life. And for you, psychoanalysis is not about applying these formula that we're all familiar with, the Oedipus complex, or I don't know, the death instinct. It's not about applying these abstractions. It's about trying to attend to the singularity of the person before you. Just as in a novel, we attend to the singularity of these characters. I wondered whether you talk about your own reading of fiction. It's something you said you've been passionately devoted to from an early age, since Charles Schulz, and you've found author after author who you thought were especially illuminating. Actually, one of those authors was D.H. Lawrence. And D.H. Lawrence is a writer who I feel, maybe I'm wrong about this, he's not much read these days, and we all feel a bit embarrassed about reading D.H. Lawrence. I've got a whole pile of D.H. Lawrence in the corner of my office. Over there, the Penguin editions of D.H. Lawrence, about 30 volumes. And you know what I was going to do last year? I took him down to Oxfam. I thought, right, I'm having done with D.H. Lawrence. D.H. Lawrence is ridiculous. It's a kind of embarrassment. I've had enough. But then, I sat down to read Women in Love, and I thought, I really can't get rid of this. Yeah. And I wasn't sure why or what it was about Lawrence's fiction that maybe want to hold on to it. But I think in this book, you write a wonderful account of marriage and what marriage involves, and about the passages in The Rainbow about Will and Anna Brangwen. And you talk about marriage as being something which always involves compromise, the recognition that you can't circumvent confusion and pain, that we as human beings are divided, pulled between impulses which are irreconcilable. And this is what Lawrence is so good at evoking. So I wonder if you speak a little bit more about Lawrence, about who I feel such a ambiguity.
Oh, I would love to. And I love your story about trying to get rid of Lawrence. It feels very close to my own experience. Lawrence, if you come to him as an adolescent, even, a sort of histrionic, self-important adolescent, still induces a kind of self-consciousness, and perhaps brings out adolescent sarcasm and irony, because you feel, well, how can every smallest gesture, every feeling, every encounter, every exchange be so freighted with intensity, with such passionate intensity? Why does everything in life need to be like that? There's something about it that evokes a kind of inner pressure and heat of adolescence that you almost want to laugh off. It's too uncomfortably recognizable. When I thought about writing about him for the marriage chapter, my first completely wrong impulse really was to imagine that he was going to be an exemplar of somebody who makes life a bit, or who presents us with a version of life which is a bit unlivable. That we cannot live at this pitch, that if we try to, we will simply collapse under the weight of its intensity. And what struck me rereading The Rainbow, and this is, I think, has something to do with that passionate dedication to fiction, that what fiction can do for us, particularly if we keep coming back to it, if we reread it, is surprise us, show us again and again what we thought we knew, but really didn't. And I thought that I was going to get lots of these sort of rather oblique and metaphysical descriptions of, say, sexual encounters. What I think I'd lost touch with in Lawrence is his feel for the undercurrents of the ordinary, the mundane, the embarrassingly and humiliatingly minute things that matter to us. And I found myself concentrating on these passages in the Rainbow where a couple who begin in a state of, who begin their marriage in a state of sort of transfixed, mutual, erotic wonderment, just lying around in bed and enjoying newlywed life, suddenly realize that they have to make some kind of reconciliation with the world. They have to start balancing their wonderment at having found each other with a kind of obligation to worldly life. And these pulls between inside and outside the window become so unbearable to them that they can only take out their frustration and their tension on each other. That as soon as there is something else to look at, the other person, precisely because they call on our attention, they call on our interest and our love, suddenly become too much for us. And so the feet that get in front of the broom, the person who's sort of hanging around uselessly, usually the man who's hanging around uselessly while the woman's trying to get on with something, and says to him a bit contemptuously, a bit impatiently, "Can't you find yourself something to do?" Now, everybody who's known a relationship recognizes this humiliatingly mundane scenario in which we sort of throw our ungenerosity and our neediness at one another and sort of weaponize them. And what Lawrence asks us to see is that in this very ordinary wrangle that makes up domestic life, there is a kind of play of metaphysical forces at work, that what is being invoked is not a little bit of comical frustration, but actually when somebody says, "Move your feet out the way, you're annoying me," we feel kind of pricked at the very core of ourselves, that there is a kind of existential threat when this person on whom we're so dependent, whom we need to love us so much and whom we need to love so much, suddenly becomes sort of casually and ordinarily hateful and finds us similarly so. That drama that can make us want to throw off life is also, of course, what makes life livable, so much more interesting, so much more worthwhile than a kind of indifferent companionability.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a couple of questions from our viewers. Joanna Chiafoni, as writers and readers, how do you feel the processes of writing and reading differ in terms of self-reflection and knowing oneself better?
Yeah, in many ways, very little. I think for me, one of the most sort of fascinating questions really is almost, what is the difference between writing and reading? Because obviously, as activities from the outside, they are appreciably different. But when you try and differentiate them from the inside as internal processes, they really start to overlap. So, writing is an attempt to activate and unfold a curiosity about yourself, about your own mind, to stage an encounter with yourself, and to learn something about yourself and your relationship to the world that you didn't already know. But I find that, well, that's exactly why I turn to a book. again, there's that analogy with the analyst, that the book is not something to be psychoanalyzed, but something that almost works as an analyst. You encounter a book and it says to you, well, who are you? What do you want to do? What are you about? Right? A book asks you the questions. You don't ask and decode the questions about it. It speaks you rather than you speak it. And writing is something similar. You go to a piece of paper thinking you have got something to say, so you'd better say it. And then you realize that the only point in this exercise is if you don't know what you're going to say, if you have absolutely not a clue what you're doing. And so I think they're both processes in which experiences, not processes, they're experiences in which we have to risk a kind of derailment of the known self.
Indeed. And another question here, to take the analogy between literature and psychoanalysis slightly further, do you see your role as an analyst to be closer to that of a reader or a writer of the patient's story?
Oh gosh. I think I would hope definitely not a writer of the patient's story. I would even be weary of thinking of myself as a reader of the patient's story, although I guess it depends what we mean by that. I think really what the psychoanalytic couple, the pair, are doing together is a kind of reading together. That the patient does this extraordinarily sort of risky and generous thing of offering up their selfhood, their sense of their own soul, to be looked at, to be sort of contemplated from a small but decisive distance, right? You are sort of putting enough distance between them and themselves that they see themselves anew. They see themselves from a slightly skewed, slightly different angle. And it's a kind of reading together, I think. So, for example, when a patient brings a dream, there is a certain caricature of the analyst as taking up all the elements of the dream and decoding the symbols and saying, well, this means this and this means that, and this relates to what happened yesterday, and this relates to the way your mother breastfed you, and so on. In fact, what happens is a sort of knocking together of two unconscious minds, and a kind of an encounter between two listeners to the content of the dream, bouncing off one another. And in that sense, it's a reading and a writing that are happening together, and again, kind of slightly confounding our sense that we know what the difference is between because I think in psychoanalysis we read ourselves and write ourselves by reading ourselves.
Listening is something very important in both psychotherapy and in fiction writing, you argue. The psychoanalyst, of course, is open, receptive to different currents of communication, whether verbal or non-verbal, conscious or unconscious. And this requires, on the part of the psychoanalyst, a kind of stereophonic listening of some kind, and also on the part of the patient too, I suppose. Listening to others and listening to oneself. This is also something which you argue that a fiction writer does. The fiction writer, you say, is attentive to his own creations, eking out the nuances and rhythms of speaking and moving and feeling that make his characters who they are. And this requires a stereophonic listening to others and to himself. So this is the idea then, it's that the patient is not simply passive, the analyst is not this person who's active. As you say, being in therapy is an extended exercise, not only in speaking freely, but in listening to oneself do so, noticing how we get stuck down habitual, ossified paths of thinking and attempting to find ways to open up new ones. And you say, what is reading a novel, if not opening our mind's ear to other voices? So listening in that sense is the indispensable lesson that both psychotherapy and fiction can offer in how to live and what to do. Does that summarize the fundamental lesson?
I think it does. I think it does. Thank you for picking up the passage, Lars. Both of us, of course, have a kind of lifelong love affair with French writer and critic Maurice Blanchot. And what the passage, I mean, I didn't quote this line in the book, but he has in a very difficult essay, he has a wonderful line where in a discussion about why people read, he says, you can write a book that you imagine people want to read. The problem is nobody wants to read a book that's written for them. They want to read, they want to hear another voice, not their own voice. And I think that tells us with a kind of beautiful precision why people come to analysis, even if they don't yet know that's why they've come. They have heard too much of their own voice and they want to hear another voice kind of peek through.
A voice from elsewhere, another voice. That's it. Exactly. Yes, a voice from elsewhere. Yes, of course. And I guess my final point, I don't have notes here. I didn't actually write this down, but I was struck when you were giving an account of Mrs Dalloway and Virginia Woolf in general. You quoted that famous passage that Virginia Woolf writes about life and how the novelist can capture life. And I was very struck the way in which you contrasted what Virginia Woolf was up to in her fiction, so sensitive, so nuanced, with what she criticised in her essays as Edwardian fiction.
Yeah.
In some sense, with Virginia Woolf, there's a way of writing that opens her to the possibility of listening. And this listening was not something which was possible for those writers of the Edwardian realist novel. I wonder if you could enlarge a little about that.
Yeah, I mean, that comes in a chapter on middle age. And it seems to me that one of the things, I mean, Woolf writes a lot about middle age, but it comes back to our discussion about the relationship. We were talking about Graham and the relationship in him between his middle age and his adolescence. And what happens is that there's in middle age, the kind of caricatural stodginess of middle age is really about a cutting off from the energy and the passion of adolescence. And that, of course, fuels a listening which infuses life with a kind of perceptual and emotional intensity, which in Woolf can sometimes be very difficult to bear, although it's worth the effort. And it contrasts with those Edwardian novelists who really invest externalities with everything. They consider themselves to be novelists of social conscience, to be intervening in the outside world. But in trying to intervene in important social issues, what she's saying is they lose everything that make social issues worth agitating for. What is the point in sort of tweaking social arrangements if it isn't accompanied by a revolution in consciousness, by a kind of an infusion of life with livability? For Woolf, transformation, social transformation also has to be experiential transformation. And her fictions, I think, are masterclasses in experiential transformation, in sort of seeing what's at stake, in getting up in the morning, in walking down a street, in looking up and seeing an ordinary vista in London or in Sussex.
This reminds me of a passage I know it's very important to you, which you quote in the book. It's from Mrs Dalloway. And this is a passage where the main character of Mrs Dalloway, Clarissa, reflects on, well, I suppose it's more than reflect on, she performs a kind of overwhelming love of life, which overwhelms her. It's a very, very moving passage. If I just read this, and I think this might take us to the end of our hour. Odd, incredible. She'd never been so happy. Nothing could be slow enough, nothing last too long. No pleasure could equal, she thought, straightening the chairs, pushing in one book on the shelf, this having done with the triumphs of youth, lost herself in the process of living, to find it with a shock of delight, as the sun rose, as the day sank.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard really to add anything to that. The one thing I will say, of course, is that apparently this is a novel about an unhappy woman, about a woman whose life has been reduced to, you know, it's sort of experiential bare bones. All she does is plan a party, play the role of a dutiful wife. She's lonely, and she's sort of desperately clinging to figures in her life who don't seem to have much interest in her. And yet from inside that ordinary unhappiness, she finds this moment of ecstasy. She finds a way to embrace life, even at the moment that it seems most denuded and deprived. And I think that, you know, that is for me the point at which psychoanalysis and great fiction can come together. That whatever our life looks at like externally, however unpromising and difficult and painful and ugly it may seem, from the inside, there's got to be something about it that allows us to be curious, to get close to it, and to live it.
Sure. Thank you. I think that takes us to the hour.